Okay, this video is John Ruskin, art hero number 2, and he is academic hero about number 22. And we'll start out here with a painting by Raphael from the School of Athens. This was made in 1511 at the Vatican. So Raphael was obviously an incredible illustrator, and this time of the Renaissance in Italy was sort of a new increased appreciation for a lot of the classical philosophy and knowledge and art. And out of Constantinople, philosophers and writers and scholars were coming to Italy, to Athens, and they brought a lot of new knowledge with them. And the Medici family, had paid for translations of these ancient Greek and Roman books. And Raphael had advisors at the Vatican that helped him to understand the whole history of philosophy. And this painting is a great celebration of that. And these were in the signature room in the Vatican. And on one wall was the philosophy, as we have here, this painting, School of Athens. Right across from it was the School of Poetry and Song called Mount Parnassus. And then there was also the School of Theology on another facing wall. And the person we're going to talk about here is John Ruskin. And he was actually offended by this. I'll explain why just with the next slide or two here. So this is John Ruskin, a painting by John Everett Millais in 1853. And he was from Scottish origin, sort of that Scottish Presbyterian Calvinist background, real self-righteous. He was also a genius. He was also crazy. And in my experience, I've studied tons of these geniuses. All of them are a little bit crazy and a little weird, and you have to forgive them that, or you won't have any geniuses to study. So instead of just enjoying the fact that he was a multimillionaire back in the Victorian age, he actually felt an obligation to try to make England better. He was very distressed by how miserable and terrible the conditions were for the poor in the workhouses and the factories. And he's sort of like what Charles Dickens was to literature. And Charles Dickens had grown up very poor and had to be in the poorhouses for a little while and have to work at a young age, drop out of school. Ruskin sort of is similar to that. This idea of the Industrial Revolution for the poor people was a disaster in England. And one of the things that really was a big part of Ruskin's life as an art critic. He was an art critic and an artist himself and a professor at Oxford. He's actually the professor teaching Oscar Wilde. So this artist here, John Everett Millais, is one of a group of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Pre-Raphaelites were a group of artists who felt that since the time of Raphael, art was going downhill, that the artists were just trying to make a quick, fast buck with a portrait and make people look beautiful, and that there was no meaning in their art, and it was very superficial. So the Pre-Raphaelites were sort of a throwback to a more sincere form of art, more true to nature, more realistic. And they also painted a lot of scenes from King Arthur and a lot of scenes from Shakespeare. So this is the painting of Ophelia, of course, from Hamlet. And you can see it's rather magnificent, the detail of Ophelia here. This was actually a model who was in the bathtub while Millais painted her, and then the incredible painting of the nature. So this was a rather incredible painting, and this is some of the things that Ruskin really emphasized. Being true to nature and painting things of historical significance were things that he really appreciated and encouraged. And he helped out, because Ruskin was very famous at this time, and he made a great speech in defense of the Pre-Raphaelites, and with his approval they became very famous and sold a lot of their paintings, whereas before that they were not too successful. So this was a big deal that he stood up for them, and it was actually kind of a great moment in the history of art in England and Europe. So here's a typical quote from Ruskin: "All art is either instruction or infection." He was really self-righteous and kind of a pain in the butt in some ways, but that's also what made him fun and made him great. He was quite world famous for a while there in the 1800s, and he did a lot of good things. So he's like the polemical prophet of art criticism and art history. One compliment from Ruskin and a painting would sell big. He used the art history a little bit like Plato, not quite as certainly as influential as Plato, but he's sort of in the middle of all kinds of art history and art criticism. And he'll have all these rantings, which you could almost mock him, but you can't help liking him or admiring him. He stood up for a lot of good things, and then he's funny too, because he's a Protestant, and then he traveled around Europe seeing all the art, and he would keep on trying to praise the Protestant artists, but it's kind of a joke because the Catholic artists were so much better. And the pre-Raphaelites, being Protestants of England, were starting to show that Protestants could be great painters as well. But it would be funny when he would praise some relative lightweight painter like Turner in England, and try to put him up at the same level as the Catholic Italian painters, which is ridiculous. Raphael and Michelangelo and Caravaggio. Augustus Welby Pugin was the big leader of Gothic architecture revival. So Ruskin noted all these poor people and these factory conditions are like humans in like animal cages. And Pugin also was a big proponent of the Gothic cathedrals were so much more beautiful than these ugly Protestant, churches and living quarters. William Morris was the person, along with Dickens, trying to improve social conditions for the poor who were sort of crushed by the industrial age in Victorian England, mid-1800s and whatnot. So like Charles Dickens would be writing about the poor, writing his books about the poor, William Morris and Ruskin trying to form social programs to help them. And this was a time when there was sort of an awareness of this transition. Victor Hugo was a magnificent writer in France, Dostoevsky in Russia, sort of where is society going? Are we going to be a society where we help each other and care about each other, or are we going to be sort of a brutal survival of the fittest type society? And that was sort of playing its way out in the mid to late 1800s. Thomas Cole and the Hudson School of Art are somewhat reminiscent of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in art, and that's a topic for another day. But there was this magnificent, almost Renaissance-like moment in art in the mid-1800s, and Ruskin was sort of leading this new appreciation of great art that had passion and meaning in it and symbolism in it. So I'm going to read you now a quote from Ruskin's speech, which is a rather incredible speech. So this is John Ruskin, 1853. There have been 3 ages in painting. The classical period ending with the fall of Rome. The medieval period extending to Raphael. Following Raphael is the modern age. Classicism art was pagan. Medieval art was Christian. Modern art denies Christ. All ancient art was religious. All modern art is profane. The ancient art was moral. Modern art is immoral. In medieval art, truth is first and beauty second. In modern art, beauty is first and truth is second. All ancient and medieval art was religious. All modern art is profane. This distinction is as firm as light and darkness. He who offers God a second place offers him no place. Raphael, on one Vatican wall, wrote that the kingdom of theology is presided over by Christ. And on the other wall, he wrote that the kingdom of poetry is presided over by Apollo. And from that spot and that hour, the intellect and the art of Italy date their degradation. Raphael elevated the creations of fancy to the same rank as the objects of faith on the other. The doom of the arts of Europe went forth from that chamber. The medieval principles led up to Raphael, and the modern principles lead down from him. Just as classical art was great in building to its gods, medieval art was great in building to its God, and modern art is not great because it builds to no God. So here's just some of the paintings to get a sense of them. This is one of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of Protestant painters in England in the mid-1800s, William Holman Hunt. This painting is called The Light of the World. Okay, a little more on Ruskin and some of the other persons busy at that time in the arts in England. One was Pugin. Pugin really admired the Gothic cathedrals and he hated the Protestant churches. And here's a quote from Pugin in the mid-1800s. "Gothic is the only appropriate style for the building of a Catholic church. Everything glorious about English churches is Catholic. Everything debased and hideous is Protestant. Gothic is about light and color and beauty and splendor, with soaring lines that lift the human spirit heavenward. The heaven-pointing spire is a beautiful and instructive emblem of Christians' brightest hopes." So that's Augustus Welby Pugin. Okay, Ruskin really liked the painting Triumph of Death by Francisco Trani and Orcagna in 1339. It was a great example of medieval art. You can find it online to see a picture of it. It's hard to find one in good condition. There's some art courses that have good paintings of it and whatnot. But it's sort of, you see this incredible feeling in the painting, even though the technical details are not as great as the Pre-Raphaelites, for example. So here's another quote from Ruskin. "Better the rudest work that tells a story than the richest without meaning." And he also was the same way talking about music. Here's Ruskin again. "Music, when healthy, is the teacher of perfect order, and when depraved, the teacher of perfect disorder." And I actually think that's true, because I've noticed young people, the good music is typically going to be based on a melody. And don't get me wrong, you can like beat-based music when you're working out and lifting weights, but if you always listen to beat-based music, you can't think. It's too loud, the bump, bump, bump. You can't think, versus when you're music based on a melody where you can hear the words, there's a story, you think about it, it connects you to something. So here is, some more of these paintings. And this is the Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse, influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is part of the story. This is a lady who was in love with Sir Lancelot. So a lot of what they did, too, had to do with the, the King Arthur and the Round Table stories, the chivalry and sort of this pride in England's history. And here's another one of these paintings, and there's a lot of them. They're beautiful. Okay, this is Godspeed, painted by Edmund Leighton in 1900, influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And here is Meeting on the Turret Stairs, also sort of the King Arthur legends. This by Frederick Burton in 1864. And you can see the incredible, realistic detail, the emotion, the story of it. And there's a whole bunch of these. They're magnificent. And here's from the legend of Tristan and Isolde, a very famous story, and that relates to the King Arthur legends. And so this one's from Edmund Leighton. It's magnificent stuff. So Ruskin was right. He did a good thing. He helped out these poor, struggling young artists, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and it brought about a renaissance in great, beautiful painting in England in the 1800s, and usually, I would say that the Protestants kind of stink at art. Their cathedrals in general stink. Most of their art had stunk, but now, wow, they did incredible work after, Ruskin gave them a couple pep talks. So let's see. The principal role of the artist is truth to nature, from John Ruskin. And these are some of the paintings we just looked at. There's some artists that were great in the 1900s on a similar type of work. Norman Rockwell, Arnold Freeberg, Don Troiani. Robert Bateman was a nature artist, but still this magnificent realism and the emotional and the symbolism is all fantastic. And I admire Ruskin. He was a multimillionaire. He didn't have to do anything for anybody. He could have just enjoyed his wealth. Instead, he went around trying to help everybody. He was very nice. And he was kind of fun, especially when he was young. He was a really energetic writer, sort of a Bible-thumping prophet. And of course he overreacted and was emotional, but that's partly what made him so entertaining. Ruskin, in his own way, was trying to save the world as he saw it. He felt that this destruction of the poor, grinding them into the ground in these factories, was not a good thing and was not necessary. He felt that, England was sort of in a spiritual war, if you will, between a culture of life and a culture of death. And the culture of life is like love of family and creativity and craftsmanship. He admired the craftsmanship of the Gothic architecture in comparison with the serfdom-like labor he saw in the industrial factories of that time and all the pollution. And he also noted that the houses the people lived in, they were like little more than animal cages. He thought it was disgusting. And I thought, it'd be nice if the modern world, tried to make things better rather than subjugated the rich people of our time. Back in the 1400s and the 1500s, the Medicis funded all this art, this incredible stuff. And then later, the papacy, like Pope Julius, for example, whatever you want to say about Pope Julius, he rebuilt the Vatican, and he had Michelangelo and Raphael make the most magnificent paintings of all time. Usury was considered a sin, and the Medici family, in a sense, were trying to buy their way out of hell by patronizing the arts and education of that time in the Italian Renaissance. I joke that given that indulgences built the Renaissance art, and from Botticelli to Michelangelo to Raphael, I wish they would start selling indulgence again, Okay, Ruskin's quote, "The teaching of art is the teaching of all things." I talked about the paradox of Ruskin, that he was a Protestant and he just would go into conniptions trying to claim that Protestant art was as good as Catholic art. Okay, so this is the last slide. All great art is the work of the whole living creature, body and soul, and chiefly the soul. Truth, beauty, and religion are bound together. John Ruskin. He continues. Gothic cathedrals to their God, to the Victorian age, Englishmen working in filthy factories, pumping out pollution with smokestacks everywhere. And now here's one of my favorite quotes from John Ruskin. Because he saw the Middle Ages built these magnificent cathedrals, the best buildings ever made. There were Renaissance artists in the 1400s that were incredible, better than any artist of the current time, like I showed in a previous recent talk, Rogier van der Weyden. Incredible stuff. Okay, so here's the quote from Ruskin that I love. They didn't live in the Dark Ages, we do. That ability to see outside of one's time, because he had studied so much art and traveled so much, he knew what was out there. Ruskin continues, industrialism is more than an age of machines. It turns men into machines. So I think that's a great quote too. The way they're just sort of another bolt or cog in the factory. There's almost a tendency sometimes for excessive modernism without, much culture, tradition, to almost make people like into animals. And that's no joke. If you look at, Darwinism, comparison with, Charles Leibniz, there's God or there's nothingness. And if a persons are separated from being created in the image of God, then classified by Darwinism as talking primates, that dramatically lowers their status. So Thomas Carlyle was a famous scholar of the Victorian age. He was one of Ruskin's mentors. He asked the question, where are the railroads leading us? Because that was the big technology of that day, all these new railroads in England. And Charles Dickens answered, the railroads are leading us to spiritual death when they make us forget who we are. So then the question could arise for our age. Where is the internet taking us? Is it educating us, or is it delivering us to the concentration camps, dehumanizing us? That's an important question. Okay, a little bit more about Ruskin when he was a professor at Oxford, and Oscar Wilde was a student and friend. Oscar Wilde really admired Ruskin, and here's just some of the nice things Oscar Wilde used to say about Ruskin. The dearest memories of my Oxford days were my walks and talks with you. From you I learned nothing but was good. There is something in you of the prophet, the priest, and the poet, and to you the gods gave eloquence such as they have given none other, so that your message might come to us with the fire of passion and the marvel of music, making the deaf to hear and the blind to see. Okay, so here's just the last quote from John Ruskin. All great art is praise.